The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat in the sterile waiting area of Phoenix Sky Harbor's Chaplain's office. My boarding pass crumpled in my trembling hands. The flight to our anniversary destination in Hawaii had departed 30 minutes ago without me, and my husband Kevin was nowhere to be found. What started as a romantic getaway had become the moment that shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Little did Kevin know that this abandonment would lead me to discover wings I never knew I had. And when I returned, it wouldn't be as his broken wife, but as the owner of my own aviation company, landing my personal aircraft right where he least expected it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started with such promise. I remember standing in our walk-in closet in our North Phoenix home, carefully selecting outfits for our long-awaited second honeymoon to Maui. Kevin and I had been married for 4 years, and the past 18 months had been challenging with his promotion to regional sales director at the medical device company where he worked. The new position meant constant travel, late nights, and a growing distance between us that I kept telling myself was temporary. This trip was supposed to reconnect us, to remind us why we fell in love during those early days when he was still climbing the corporate ladder, and I was working as a freelance graphic designer. Kevin had been unusually quiet during the drive to the airport, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he navigated the morning traffic. I attributed his mood to work stress and the early departure time. Our flight was scheduled for 8:45, and we'd left the house at 6:30 to account for security lines and the usual airport chaos. I chatted about our itinerary, the snorkeling excursion I'd booked, the romantic dinner reservations at the resort, but his responses were minimal grunts and distracted nods. At the departure level, he pulled up to the curb and popped the trunk without getting out of the car. This struck me as odd since we always parked in long-term parking and walked in together, but when I questioned it, he claimed he'd received an urgent work call and needed to handle it before joining me inside. He promised to meet me at the gate after parking and dealing with his crisis, kissing my forehead in that absent way that had become his default gesture of affection. I dragged both our suitcases through the sliding doors, expecting him to catch up before I reached the check-in counter. The airline representative, a cheerful woman named Patricia, processed our boarding passes with practiced efficiency. When she asked where my travel companion was, I explained he was parking the car and would be along shortly. She smiled knowingly and wished us a wonderful anniversary trip. Security moved faster than expected, and I found myself at gate B12 with nearly an hour to spare. I settled into the uncomfortable waiting area chairs, periodically checking my phone for updates from Kev. His first text came 20 minutes later, claiming his work emergency was more complicated than expected, but assuring me he'd make it before boarding. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too devastating to consider. The boarding announcements began with first class and elite members. I texted Kevin that we were beginning to board, expecting to see him jogging down the concourse any moment. His response was immediate and shocking in its coldness. "Sorry, can't make it. Work crisis. Go without me or cancel. Your choice." I stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the words penetrated my consciousness. 20 minutes before our anniversary flight, via text message, my husband was abandoning our romantic getaway. I called him immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. My hands shook as I tried again with the same result. The gate agent announced general boarding as I frantically typed responses, asking if this was some kind of joke, begging him to explain what was happening. No replies came. Around me, couples and families moved toward the boarding line, chattering excitedly about their Hawaiian adventures, while I sat frozen in disbelief. When they announced final boarding, a kind flight attendant approached me with concern. I must have looked as devastated as I felt because she gently asked if I was all right. Through tears I couldn't control, I explained that my husband wasn't coming, that I didn't know what to do. She suggested I speak with the gate agent about rebooking, but when I approached the counter, the flight had already departed. The finality of watching our plane taxi away from the gate felt like watching my marriage disappear into the distance. The gate agent, whose nameplate read Jennifer, listened patiently as I explained my situation. She was sympathetic but could only offer to help me rebook for the next available flight, which wasn't until the following afternoon, and would cost a substantial change. I realized I couldn't afford the financial or emotional cost of pursuing this trip alone. What was supposed to be our romantic reconnection had become a humiliating public abandonment. Jennifer noticed my distress and suggested I speak with someone in the chaplain's office, a service the airport provided for travelers experiencing various crises. I'd never known such a place existed, but at that moment, I was grateful for any refuge from the curious stares of other passengers and my own spiraling thoughts. She personally escorted me to a quiet corridor near the baggage claim area, where a simple door marked Interfaith Chaplain Services offered sanctuary. Father Michael Santos opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd sensed my approach. He was a gentle man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a calming presence that immediately put me at ease. His office was small but comfortable, with soft lighting, tissue boxes strategically placed, and inspirational quotes from various faith traditions adorning the walls. He invited me to sit in a cushioned chair across from his desk and simply waited for me to speak. The story poured out of me in broken sentences punctuated by tears I'd been holding back since reading Kevin's text. Father Santos listened without judgment, occasionally offering gentle prompts that encouraged me to share more detail. As I spoke, patterns I'd ignored for months became impossible to deny. Kevin's increasing emotional distance, his impatience with my career aspirations, his subtle criticism of my appearance and interests, his growing obsession with status and material success. I told Father Santos about the dinner party 3 weeks earlier where Kevin had introduced me to his colleagues as just a freelance designer, with a dismissive wave of his hand, minimizing work I was proud of. I recounted the conversation where he'd suggested I consider a more traditional career path that would complement his professional image, perhaps something in education or nonprofit work that wouldn't compete with his ambition. I shared how he'd been increasingly critical of my close relationship with my younger brother Tyler, claiming that family loyalty was holding me back from growing up. Father Santos asked thoughtful questions that helped me recognize patterns I'd been rationalizing away. When had I last felt truly supported by Kevin? When had I last pursued my own interests without considering his approval first? When had I stopped feeling like an equal partner in our marriage and started feeling like an accessory to his success? The answers were painful but clarifying. As I sat in that quiet office, surrounded by wisdom from ages past, something shifted inside me. The devastation of being abandoned began transforming into a different emotion entirely: relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking on eggshells around Kevin's mood. I wasn't monitoring my words to avoid triggering his impatience. I wasn't suppressing my own needs to accommodate his preferences. In the strange sanctuary of the airport chaplain's office, I began to remember who Rachel Morgan had been before she became Kevin Brooks's wife. Father Santos didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. Instead, he asked me what I wanted to do next, emphasizing that this was my choice to make without considering what Kevin might want or expect. The question surprised me because I'd grown so accustomed to factoring his preferences into every decision that making an independent choice felt foreign and frightening. I thought about returning home to our shared house, to the bed we slept in, to the life we'd built together. The prospect filled me with dread rather than comfort. I imagined Kevin returning from whatever had been more important than our marriage, offering explanations and apologies that wouldn't address the fundamental disrespect he'd shown. I pictured myself accepting his excuses, agreeing to reschedule our trip, pretending this incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a revelation of how little he valued our relationship. Then I thought about the graphic design portfolio I'd been building, the creative projects I'd set aside to support Kevin's career demands. I remembered the photography class I'd wanted to take but canceled because it conflicted with his company event. I recalled the girls' trip to Sedona my college friends had invited me on that I'd declined because Kevin needed me available for a work function that ultimately got canceled. When had I become so small in my own life? Father Santos suggested I consider taking some time away to gain perspective on my situation. He mentioned that many people found clarity in solitude, away from familiar environments and expectations. The idea resonated deeply, though it terrified me. I'd never traveled alone, never made a major decision without consulting Kevin, never prioritized my own emotional needs over his convenience. As I sat in that chaplain's office, watching planes take off through the small window, I made the first independent decision I'd made in years. I would not go home to wait for Kevin's explanations. I would not pretend this abandonment was acceptable. I would not continue living as a supporting character in my own life story. I was going to drive north to Sedona, a place that had always called to me but that Kevin dismissed as too hippie for his taste. Father Santos helped me call the airline to officially cancel my tickets and arrange for my luggage to be retrieved. He also provided me with contact information for counselors who specialized in relationship transitions, though he emphasized that seeking professional help was my choice to make when I felt ready. His final words to me were simple but profound. Sometimes what feels like abandonment is actually liberation in disguise. I left the chaplain's office with a strange mixture of heartbreak and anticipation. My marriage had effectively ended in an airport waiting area, but as I walked toward the rental car counter, I felt lighter than I had in months. I was about to embark on a journey that would transform me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Though at that moment, all I knew was that I needed to get as far away from my old life as possible. The young man at the rental counter whose badge identified him as Marcus was exceptionally helpful as I explained my change of plans. When I mentioned I was driving to Sedona alone, his face lit up with enthusiasm. He recommended specific scenic routes, suggested hiking trails appropriate for beginners, and even provided me with a map marked with his favorite viewpoint. His genuine excitement about my spontaneous adventure was infectious, and for the first time since reading Kevin's devastating text, I smiled. As I signed the rental agreement for a small SUV suitable for mountain driving, Marcus mentioned that his girlfriend worked at a bed and breakfast in Sedona that catered to solo travelers seeking reflection and renewal. He offered to call ahead and see if they had availability, explaining that the owner, Carmen Delgado, was known for creating a supportive environment for people going through life transitions. The synchronicity felt like a sign that I was making the right choice. The drive north from Phoenix to Sedona took nearly 2 hours, winding through desert landscapes that gradually gave way to stunning red rock formations. With each mile I felt the weight of my failed marriage lifting slightly. I'd turned off my phone after Kevin's third unanswered call, needing silence to process what had happened and what it meant for my future. The dramatic scenery provided a perfect backdrop for contemplation, and by the time I reached the outskirts of Sedona, I was beginning to feel something I hadn't experienced in months. Carmen's bed and breakfast, called Red Rock Sanctuary, sat nestled among towering sandstone formations that glowed golden in the late afternoon sun. The property was smaller and more intimate than I'd expected, with just 6 guest rooms arranged around a central courtyard where a fountain provided soothing background music. Carmen herself greeted me at the front desk, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life lived fully. She didn't ask intrusive questions about why I was traveling alone or what had brought me to Sedona so unexpected. Instead, she simply welcomed me with genuine warmth and showed me to a cozy room, overlooking the courtyard. The space was decorated in earth tones with Native American artwork and large windows that framed the red rocks beyond. It felt peaceful in a way my shared home with Kevin never had, despite all our expensive furnishings and carefully coordinated decor. That evening, as I sat on the small patio outside my room watching the sunset paint the rocks in shades of orange and purple, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what had happened. My husband had abandoned me at the airport rather than go on our anniversary trip. He'd done so via text message, without explanation or apology, treating our marriage as casually as he might cancel a business meeting. The disrespect was breathtaking in its completeness, and I finally admitted to myself that this behavior wasn't an aberration but rather the culmination of months of similar disregard for my feelings and needs. I thought about the credit cards in my wallet, the savings account I'd contributed to equally despite Kevin's higher salary, the investments we'd made together during our marriage. I realized I had resources and options I'd been too emotionally devastated to consider while sitting in that airport chaplain's office. I wasn't helpless or dependent, though Kevin's treatment of me had made me feel that way. I was a grown woman with skills, intelligence, and the legal right to make decisions about my own life. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, I made a mental list of the steps I needed to take. I would extend my stay in Sedona for at least a week to gain clarity about my situation. I would contact a divorce attorney to understand my rights and options. I would begin rebuilding my sense of independence and self-worth that had eroded during my marriage to Kevin. Most importantly, I would stop allowing his approval or disapproval to dictate my choices and actions. The next morning, I woke before dawn and stepped onto my patio to watch the sunrise illuminate the red rocks. The beauty was overwhelming, and I understood why people considered Sedona a spiritual place of healing and transformation. As the light shifted and changed the landscape before me, I felt something shifting within me, as well. The broken woman who'd been abandoned at the airport was beginning to evolve into someone stronger, someone who refused to accept disrespect disguised as love. Carmen knocked on my door shortly after sunrise, carrying a tray with coffee and fresh pastries. She explained that she often checked on guests during their first morning, especially those who seemed to be processing difficult emotions. Over breakfast, I found myself sharing the story of my airport abandonment with someone who listened without judgment or unsolicited advice. Carmen simply nodded and shared that she'd opened the bed and breakfast after her own divorce, transforming her pain into a sanctuary for others experiencing life transition. That conversation planted a seed that would eventually grow into something extraordinary, though I couldn't know it at the time. All I knew was that for the first time in months, I felt understood and supported by another person. Carmen invited me to join her for a morning hike to one of the less crowded vortex sites, explaining that the physical activity and natural beauty often helped people gain perspective on their situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As we walked through the desert landscape, breathing in the clean mountain air and marveling at the unique rock formations, I began to feel connected to my own strength again. Kevin's abandonment had been devastating, but it had also freed me from a relationship that was slowly diminishing my spirit. Walking through that magnificent landscape, I started to believe that this ending might actually be a beginning in disguise. The red rocks of Sedona became my cathedral during those first weeks of solitude. Each morning, I would wake before dawn and sit on my patio with coffee, watching the landscape transform from deep purple shadows to brilliant copper as the sun crested the eastern peaks. Carmen had extended my stay indefinitely after I explained that I needed time to figure out my next steps, and she'd reduced my rate in exchange for helping with the bed and breakfast social media presence. It was the perfect arrangement, giving me purpose without pressure while allowing me to heal at my own pace. My phone remained mostly silent after I'd finally answered Kevin's increasingly frantic calls 3 days into my stay. That conversation had been brief and illuminating. He'd been furious that I'd disappeared without telling him where I was going, claiming my behavior was irrational and embarrassing. When I reminded him that he'd abandoned me at the airport via text message, he dismissed it as a work emergency that I should have understood. He demanded I return home immediately to discuss our situation like adults, but his tone suggested he viewed me as a child having a tantrum rather than a wife who'd been profoundly disrespected. I'd hung up on him mid-sentence and turned off my phone for the rest of the day. The silence was liberating. For years I'd been conditioned to respond immediately to Kevin's communications, to prioritize his needs and schedule over my own. Breaking that pattern felt like shedding a skin that had grown too tight. When I finally turned the phone back on that evening, there were 17 missed calls and a string of text messages that ranged from apologetic to demanding to threatening. I deleted them all without reading past the first few words and blocked his number. The physical separation from Kevin allowed me to remember who I'd been before our relationship consumed my identity. During our marriage, I'd gradually abandoned hobbies and interests that didn't align with his preferences or schedule. Photography had been my passion in college, but Kevin found my camera equipment cluttered and complained when editing sessions kept me up late. I'd sold my professional-grade camera 2 years ago to help fund his MBA program, telling myself it was a temporary sacrifice for our shared future. Carmen noticed me admiring the landscape photography hanging throughout the bed and breakfast and mentioned that the artist, Elena Vasquez, lived nearby and occasionally taught workshops for visitors. When she offered to introduce us, I hesitated, remembering Kevin's dismissive comments about photography being an expensive hobby rather than a practical skill. Then I caught myself deferring to his absent opinion, and immediately accepted Carmen's offer. Elena turned out to be a vibrant woman in her 40s, who'd moved to Sedona after a successful career as a corporate photographer in Los Angeles. She'd burned out on studio work and commercial assignments, finding renewal in capturing the natural beauty of the Southwest. Her home studio, tucked into a canyon just outside town, was filled with breathtaking images that made my heart ache with longing for the creative expression I'd abandoned. During our first meeting, Elena asked to see some of my work, and I embarrassingly admitted I hadn't touched a camera in over 2 years. When she pressed for the reason, I found myself explaining how I'd gradually given up creative pursuits to support my husband's career goal. Elena listened without judgment, then handed me one of her backup cameras and suggested we take a walk around her property to see if I still remembered how to compose a shot. The weight of the camera in my hands felt like greeting an old friend after a long absence. As we wandered through the desert landscape, something awakened in me that had been dormant for too long. I found myself seeing light and shadow differently, noticing the intricate patterns in rock formations and the way afternoon sun created dramatic contrast. Elena watched me work, offering gentle technical suggestions, but mostly encouraging me to trust my instincts. When we reviewed the images on her computer later, I was surprised by what I'd captured. The photos weren't technically perfect, but they showed an emotional connection to the landscape that couldn't be taught. Elena nodded approvingly and suggested I consider enrolling in her week-long intensive workshop that started the following Monday. The cost was significant, money I would have automatically discussed with Kevin before spending, but I realized I didn't need his permission to invest in my own growth. That evening, I called my brother Tyler for the first time since arriving in Sedona. He was the only family member I'd maintained a close relationship with, despite Kevin's subtle attempts to minimize our bond. Tyler lived in Denver working as a software engineer, and he'd never liked Kevin, though he'd kept his opinions mostly to himself to avoid causing problems in my marriage. When I told him about the airport incident and my current situation, his response was immediate and fierce. He'd been waiting for me to wake up to Kevin's controlling behavior for years, he said. He'd watched me gradually lose my spark and independence, becoming increasingly anxious about Kevin's approval and decreasingly confident in my own judgment. Tyler offered to fly to Arizona immediately, but I assured him I was safe and needed this time alone to figure things out. His unconditional support felt like water after a long drought, reminding me that I had people in my life who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Tyler also shared information that Kevin had been calling him, claiming I was having some kind of breakdown and asking for help convincing me to come home. Kevin had painted himself as the concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife, a narrative that made Tyler furious. My brother had refused to give Kevin any information about my whereabouts, and had advised him to examine his own behavior rather than pathologizing mine. This revelation confirmed that Kevin was already working to control the story of our separation, positioning himself as the victim of my irrationality. The photography workshop with Elena became a turning point in my healing process. The other participants were mostly women going through various life transitions, divorces, career changes, children leaving home, and we formed an instant community of support and understanding. Each day we explored different areas around Sedona, learning to see familiar landscapes with fresh eyes, while sharing our stories and encouraging each other's artistic growth. Through the camera lens, I began to see myself differently as well. Elena encouraged us to take self-portraits as an exercise in self-acceptance and personal narrative. At first, I was uncomfortable being the subject rather than the photographer, but gradually I learned to see myself with the same compassion I brought to capturing the natural world. The woman in those photos looked tired but determined, sad but hopeful, someone who was beginning to emerge from a long period of diminishment. On the 4th day of the workshop, we were photographing near Airport Mesa when a small private plane flew overhead, circling the red rocks, before heading toward the Sedona airport. I found myself watching its graceful movement against the azure sky, struck by the freedom it represented. Elena noticed my fascination and mentioned that she'd recently become friends with Captain James Wright, who owned a flight training school at the airport. She suggested we visit his facility for a different perspective on photographing the landscape from above. The Sedona airport sits on a mesa overlooking the town, offering panoramic views of the red rocks and surrounding high desert. Captain Wright's operation, called Desert Wings Aviation, occupied a modest hangar and office building where several small aircraft were parked on the tarmac. James himself was a retired commercial airline pilot who'd moved to Sedona to pursue his passion for general aviation and flight instruction. He was enthusiastic about showing us around and explaining how private aviation worked. As we toured the facility, I was surprised by how drawn I felt to the aircraft. I'd flown commercially many times but had never considered the possibility of learning to pilot a plane myself. When I mentioned this to Captain Wright, his eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who loved sharing his passion. He explained that many of his students were people seeking new challenges or looking to overcome fears, and he offered to take me on a discovery flight to see if aviation appealed to me. The thought of flying in a small plane should have terrified me. Kevin had always criticized my tendency toward anxiety, particularly about physical activities he considered risky. But sitting in the passenger seat of Captain Wright's Cessna 172 as we taxied toward the runway, I felt exhilarated rather than afraid. The pre-flight routine was methodical and reassuring, and James's calm competence inspired confidence in his abilities as an instructor. As we lifted off from the runway and climbed above the red rocks, I experienced a sense of freedom unlike anything I'd ever felt before. The landscape spread out below us in all directions, vast and beautiful and mine to explore. From the air, the problems that had seemed overwhelming on the ground appeared smaller and more manageable. I understood immediately why people became passionate about flying, why they spoke of aviation as a transformative experience that changed how they saw themselves and their possibility. Captain Wright let me take the controls for a few minutes during the flight, guiding my hands as I learned to feel the aircraft's response to subtle inputs. The plane was surprisingly responsive and forgiving, requiring gentle touches rather than forceful correction. When I managed to maintain level flight for several minutes without assistance, the pride I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced in years. Kevin had never encouraged me to attempt anything that might result in failure or require perseverance to master. After we landed, I was buzzing with excitement about the experience. Captain Wright explained the process of earning a private pilot license, the required training hours, the written and practical examinations, the ongoing commitment to safety and proficiency. It was a significant undertaking that would require months of dedicated study and practice, but for the first time since my marriage had begun deteriorating, I felt passionate about pursuing a goal that was entirely my own. That evening, I called Tyler again to share my discovery of aviation. He was thrilled to hear genuine excitement in my voice, something that had been absent during our conversations for the past year. When I mentioned the cost of flight training, he immediately offered to help financially, explaining that he'd been saving money to gift Kevin and me for a house down payment, but would much rather invest in my independence and happiness. His generosity moved me to tears, reminding me again that I had family who supported my dreams rather than diminishing them. The photography workshop ended with an exhibition of our work at a local gallery, where each participant shared the story behind their favorite image. I chose a self-portrait taken during my discovery flight, showing myself in the pilot's seat with the red rocks visible through the aircraft windows. In the photo, my face showed a mixture of concentration and joy that I hadn't seen in years. When I explained how aviation had awakened new possibilities in my life, the audience responded with encouraging applause, and several people approached afterward to share their own stories of reinvention. Elena pulled me aside during the reception to tell me how proud she was of my growth during the workshop. She'd watched me arrive broken and defensive, gradually opening up to new experiences and rediscovering my creative voice. The transformation was visible not just in my photography but in my posture, my confidence, and my willingness to take risks. She encouraged me to continue pursuing both photography and aviation, suggesting that the combination might lead to unique opportunities I couldn't yet imagine. Carmen had attended the exhibition and was equally supportive of my new interest. Over dinner that night, she shared her own story of reinvention after divorce, how she'd used her settlement money to purchase and renovate the bed and breakfast, creating a business that aligned with her values and interests. She suggested that I consider staying in Sedona longer to complete my flight training, offering me a permanent reduced rate in exchange for managing the property's marketing and social media presence. The offer was tempting, but I knew I needed to return to Phoenix eventually to address the practical aspects of my separation from Kevin. My belongings were still in our shared house, joint financial accounts needed to be separated, and divorce proceedings would need to be initiated. However, the thought of returning to my old life felt overwhelming after the growth I'd experienced in Sedona. I'd tasted independence and possibility, and I wasn't willing to give that up. That night I made a plan that balanced my need for continued growth with the practical requirements of ending my marriage. I would return to Phoenix to handle the legal and financial aspects of divorce, but I would also enroll in Captain Wright's flight training program and commute to Sedona several times per week for lessons. It would be expensive and time-consuming, but I'd learned that investing in my own development was worth any sacrifice required. Elena offered to help me find photography clients in the Phoenix area, leveraging her network of contacts from her Los Angeles days. Several wedding photographers she knew were looking for assistants who could handle engagement sessions and smaller events, perfect opportunities for me to rebuild my portfolio while earning income. The combination of photography work and flight training would create a busy schedule that left little time for dwelling on my failed marriage or Kevin's attempts to manipulate me into reconciliation. Before leaving Sedona, I made one final visit to the airport to officially enroll in Captain Wright's training program. He was pleased that I'd decided to pursue my pilot's license and worked with me to create a schedule that accommodated my need to be in Phoenix several days per week. We planned for me to train intensively during my time in Sedona, making maximum use of each visit to progress through the required curriculum. As I signed the enrollment paperwork, Captain Wright mentioned that several of his former students had gone on to pursue careers in aviation, including one woman who now owned a successful charter service based in Scottsdale. The comment planted a seed in my mind about possibilities I hadn't yet considered. What if aviation could become more than just a personal challenge? What if it could become the foundation for a new career that would give me complete independence from Kevin and his world? The drive back to Phoenix felt different from my desperate flight north 3 weeks earlier. I was returning, not as a broken woman fleeing her problems, but as someone who'd begun to rebuild her sense of self and purpose. My suitcase contained the camera Elena had given me as a graduation gift from the workshop, along with contact information for potential photography clients and a flight training manual I intended to study intensively. Kevin's car was in the driveway when I arrived at our house, and I steeled myself for the confrontation I'd been avoiding. The front door was unlocked, suggesting he'd been expecting my return, and I found him in the living room, surrounded by work papers and empty takeout container. He looked up as I entered, his expression cycling through relief, anger, and calculation before settling on injured concern. His opening words were predictable, focusing on how worried he'd been, and how unreasonable my behavior had been. He'd prepared an explanation for the airport incident that painted it as an unavoidable work emergency that I should have understood, and he seemed genuinely surprised when I didn't immediately accept his narrative. When I remained silent, letting him exhaust his prepared speech, his tone shifted to irritation, and then to veiled threats about the consequences of my continued defiance. I listened to his monologue without responding, observing him with the detachment I'd learned during my time in Sedona. The man I'd once found charming and ambitious now seemed small and desperate, someone whose self-worth depended entirely on controlling others, rather than developing his own character. His words washed over me without impact because I no longer needed his approval or feared his disapproval. The 3 weeks of independence had shown me what life could feel like without constantly managing his emotions and expectations. When he finished caulking, I calmly informed him that I was filing for divorce, and that he should expect to be served with papers within the week. His shock was genuine, as if he'd never considered that his behavior might have permanent consequences. He immediately shifted into negotiation mode, offering compromises and concessions that would have swayed me a month earlier but now seemed like desperate attempts to maintain control. I explained that I would be moving out permanently and that he could keep the house, since his name was on the mortgage, and he could afford the payments alone. I wanted only my personal belongings, my car, and my fair share of our joint savings account. The simplicity of my demands seemed to confuse him more than elaborate financial requests would have, and he kept pressing for what I really wanted from him. What I wanted was something he couldn't provide, a complete life transformation that had already begun without his input or permission. I wanted to become a pilot, to build a photography business, to make decisions based on my own interests, rather than someone else's expectations. I wanted to wake up each morning excited about the day ahead, rather than anxious about avoiding conflict. I wanted to discover who Rachel Morgan could become when she stopped trying to be Kevin Brooks's perfect wife. The conversation ended with him still believing he could change my mind, given enough time and the right arguments. I didn't bother correcting his assumption because I no longer cared what he believed about my motivations or my future. I packed 2 suitcases with essential items and drove to an extended stay hotel near the airport, beginning the next phase of my journey toward complete independence. That night, I studied the first chapter of my flight training manual while reviewing the photography portfolio I'd built during Elena's workshop. The images showed a woman I was still getting to know, someone braver and more adventurous than I'd ever imagined myself to be. Tomorrow, I would begin the practical work of dissolving my marriage and building a new life, but tonight I allowed myself to dream about soaring above the desert landscape in my own aircraft, free from anyone's limitations except those I chose to accept. The extended stay hotel near Phoenix Sky Harbor became my temporary headquarters as I methodically dismantled the life I'd shared with Kevin and built the foundation for something entirely new. Each morning, I would wake to the sound of aircraft taking off and landing, a constant reminder that freedom was literally within reach if I had the courage to pursue it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was living near the same airport where Kevin had abandoned me, but now those runways represented possibility rather than humiliation. My first priority was securing legal representation, and through Elena's network, I was referred to Patricia Hernandez, a family law attorney who specialized in high-asset divorces involving complex financial situations. Patricia's office in downtown Phoenix was sleek and professional, and she immediately impressed me with her direct communication style and thorough understanding of Arizona's community property law. During our initial consultation, she explained that Kevin's abandonment at the airport, while emotionally devastating, wouldn't significantly impact the financial aspects of our divorce since Arizona was a no-fault state. However, Patricia was interested in the broader pattern of controlling behavior I described, particularly Kevin's attempts to isolate me from family and discourage my career development. She explained that emotional and financial abuse could be relevant if Kevin tried to claim I was unfit to manage my share of our marital assets. She advised me to document everything, including our text message exchanges, witness accounts of his behavior at social events, and evidence of my financial contributions to our household that he'd minimized or ignored. The process of inventorying our shared assets was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Kevin had been meticulous about tracking his own investments and expenditures, but dismissive of mine, treating my income as supplemental rather than equal, despite the fact that I'd contributed nearly 40% of our household earnings during our marriage. He'd made unilateral decisions about major purchases, retirement contributions, and insurance policies, always claiming superior financial knowledge, while never actually teaching me about our investments or including me in planning discussion. Patricia recommended hiring a forensic accountant to ensure we had a complete picture of Kevin's financial holdings, particularly after I mentioned his secretive work trips and reluctance to share details about his compensation structure. She'd seen cases where controlling spouses hid assets or inflated debts to minimize their partner's share of marital property, and she wanted to be thorough in our discovery process. The additional cost was significant, but I realized that protecting my financial future was worth the investment. While Patricia's team worked on the financial investigation, I threw myself into flight training with Captain Wright. The commute to Sedona 3 times per week was exhausting, but every lesson reinforced my growing sense of independence and capability. Learning to fly required a level of personal responsibility and decision-making that Kevin had never encouraged in our relationship. As a pilot, I couldn't defer to someone else's judgment or wait for permission to act. I had to trust my training, my instruments, and ultimately myself. Captain Wright was an excellent instructor who understood that confidence building was as important as technical skill development. He gradually increased the complexity of our lessons, teaching me to handle crosswind landings, navigation challenges, and emergency procedures with calm professionalism. Each successful flight built on the previous one, creating a foundation of competence that extended far beyond aviation into every aspect of my life. During one particularly challenging lesson involving simulated engine failure, Captain Wright observed that I handled stress much better than many of his students. When I mentioned that the past few months had given me plenty of practice managing crisis situations, he nodded knowingly and shared that many of his most successful students were people who'd overcome significant personal challenges. Flying required the same skills needed for life resilience, situational awareness, decisive action, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. The photography business Elena had helped me establish was also gaining momentum. Her referrals had led to several wedding photography assignments, and I'd discovered a particular talent for capturing candid moments during engagement sessions and smaller celebrations. Working with couples who were excited about their futures provided an interesting contrast to my own relationship dissolution, but I found it healing rather than painful. Witnessing genuine partnership and mutual support reminded me what healthy relationships looked like and reinforced my decision to leave Kevin. One of my photography clients, Marcus Thompson, was particularly intriguing. He owned a small aviation consulting business that helped wealthy individuals purchase and maintain private aircraft, and when he learned about my flight training, we discovered a shared passion for aviation. Marcus had been a military pilot before transitioning to civilian consulting, and he offered valuable insights about career opportunities in general aviation that I'd never considered. During a break in his engagement session, Marcus mentioned that he'd been looking for someone to help document aircraft for his marketing materials, combining photography skills with aviation knowledge to create compelling presentations for potential buyers. The specialized nature of the work commanded premium rates, and he offered to train me on the technical aspects of aircraft photography if I was interested in expanding my service offering. The opportunity felt perfectly aligned with my developing interests, and I eagerly accepted Marcus's mentorship. He taught me how to capture the sleek lines of different aircraft models, how to photograph cockpit layouts that emphasized sophisticated avionics, and how to create images that conveyed the luxury and performance that attracted private aircraft buyers. The work was technically challenging and financially rewarding, allowing me to combine my artistic skills with my growing aviation knowledge. Marcus also introduced me to other professionals in the Phoenix aviation community, including charter operators, maintenance facilities, and flight training schools. The network was surprisingly tight-knit, and my reputation as both a skilled photographer and serious flight student began opening doors to additional opportunities. Several charter companies hired me to create marketing materials, and a local flight school asked me to photograph their fleet for a website redesign. As my aviation network expanded, I began hearing interesting information about Kevin's recent behavior from unexpected sources. Nicole Brooks, Kevin's sister who worked as a flight attendant for a major airline, reached out to me through social media after hearing about our separation. She was careful not to take sides in our marital dispute, but she shared concerning observations about Kevin's increasingly erratic behavior and financial stress that predated our airport incident. Nicole revealed that Kevin had been asking her detailed questions about airline employee benefits, particularly life insurance policies and survivor benefits, during recent family gatherings. He'd also made inappropriate comments about my family's wealth and his frustration with prenuptial agreements, despite the fact that we'd never had such an agreement, because I'd trusted him completely. Most disturbing, he'd mentioned several times that airplane accidents were often covered by multiple insurance policies, making them particularly tragic for surviving family members. These revelations prompted me to contact my insurance agent to review all the policies Kevin and I shared. I discovered that he'd increased my life insurance coverage twice during our marriage without discussing it with me, claiming that growing our coverage was financially responsible as our assets increased. He'd also changed the beneficiary arrangements on several policies, making himself the sole beneficiary instead of splitting benefits between him and my brother Tyler as we'd originally agreed. The insurance discoveries were deeply unsettling, particularly combined with Nicole's observations about Kevin's interest in aviation accidents. I shared this information with Patricia, who immediately contacted the insurance companies to freeze any policy changes, and requested detailed records of all modifications Kevin had made. She also suggested that I be extra cautious about my personal safety, particularly during flight training, until our divorce was finalized. Captain Wright was understanding when I explained the situation and implemented additional safety protocols for my training flight. He also introduced me to other female pilots who'd faced similar challenges during divorces involving controlling spouses. Their stories were sobering but inspiring, showing how aviation had provided them with both literal and metaphorical escape routes from dangerous situations. The forensic accountant Patricia had hired, David Kim, uncovered financial irregularities that exceeded even her experienced expectations. Kevin had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into individual investments without my knowledge, using my signature stamps and banking access to authorize transactions I'd never seen. He'd also taken out a substantial loan against his 401k, claiming business expenses that couldn't be verified through his employer's record. Most damaging was David's discovery of Kevin's gambling activities, hidden through a complex web of cash advances, credit card transfers, and cryptocurrency transactions. Kevin had accumulated over $60,000 in gaming debts at various Phoenix area casinos, explaining his recent financial stress and desperate attempts to access my family's resources. The evidence suggested that his interest in my life insurance policies wasn't theoretical but driven by immediate financial pressure from creditors. Armed with this comprehensive financial picture, Patricia filed a detailed divorce petition that exposed Kevin's deceptive practices and requested immediate asset protection measures. The filing caught Kevin completely off guard, as he'd apparently expected a simple dissolution that would leave him with the majority of our shared wealth. His attorney's response was predictably aggressive, claiming that my evidence was fabricated, and that my behavior since leaving indicated mental instability requiring psychiatric evaluation. Kevin's attempt to paint me as mentally unstable backfired spectacularly when Patricia presented evidence of my successful business development, flight training progress, and stable housing situation. The contrast between his financial chaos and my methodical life rebuilding was stark, and the family court judge expressed skepticism about his claims regarding my competence. The judge also noted that Kevin's failure to respond to discovery requests suggested he was hiding additional financial information. During this legal maneuvering, I continued progressing through my flight training with remarkable speed. Captain Wright attributed my rapid advancement to the focus and determination I'd developed while managing my divorce proceeding. Learning to fly while simultaneously handling complex legal and financial challenges had strengthened my multitasking abilities and reinforced my confidence in high-pressure situations. My solo flight milestone was particularly meaningful, representing complete independence in the most literal sense possible. As I taxied the Cessna 17-2 to the runway alone for the first time, I thought about the woman who'd been abandoned at an airport just 4 months earlier. That person could never have imagined sitting in the pilot's seat, about to take off entirely on her own skills and judgment. The transformation felt almost miraculous. The flight itself was flawless, a perfect pattern around the Sedona airport with smooth takeoffs, confident radio communications, and a gentle landing that Captain Wright praised as textbook perfect. As I shut down the engine and completed my post-flight checklist, I felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended aviation. I'd literally risen above my circumstances and proven to myself that I could handle complex challenges independently. Marcus Thompson attended my solo flight celebration at Captain Wright's hangar, bringing champagne and congratulations along with an intriguing business proposition. His aviation consulting practice was expanding rapidly, and he'd been considering hiring a partner who could handle both the photography aspects of aircraft marketing and the growing demand for pilot services among his clients. He offered me a position that would combine my developing skills while providing the financial stability I needed to complete my divorce and establish true independence. The partnership opportunity was exactly what I'd been hoping for without realizing it. Marcus's established business would provide steady income and professional credibility, while allowing me to continue developing my aviation skill. His client base included successful entrepreneurs and executives, who appreciated working with someone who understood both the technical and aesthetic aspects of aircraft ownership. The position would also require me to eventually obtain additional pilot certifications, including instrument and commercial rating. During our partnership discussions, Marcus shared that several of his clients had expressed interest in supporting women entering aviation careers, particularly those overcoming personal challenges to pursue their dream. One client, a successful real estate developer named Sarah Chen, had specifically mentioned wanting to mentor women pilots and had offered to provide financial backing for the right candidates' advanced training and aircraft acquisition. The possibility of aircraft ownership had seemed like a distant dream when I'd started flight training, but Marcus explained that fractional ownership and partnership arrangements made it more accessible than most people realize. Sarah Chen was looking for a qualified pilot to share ownership of a high-performance aircraft that would be used for both personal travel and charter services. The arrangement would provide me with access to sophisticated equipment while generating income through charter flight. As my legal situation stabilized and my aviation career began taking shape, I started planning for the confrontation with Kevin that I knew was inevitable. Patricia advised that our divorce would likely require a formal hearing where both parties would present their cases to the judge. Kevin's attorney had been fighting our asset division proposals and questioning my capacity to manage complex financial arrangements, setting up a courtroom battle that would determine both our financial future. I realized that appearing at that hearing as a successful aviation professional with documented business partnerships and advanced pilot certifications would be far more powerful than any verbal arguments about my competence. Kevin had spent our marriage undermining my confidence and capabilities, but I would prove through actions rather than words that his assessments had been completely wrong. The irony of using aviation to demonstrate my independence wasn't lost on me, given that Kevin's abandonment had occurred at an airport. The location that had represented my lowest moment would ultimately become the symbol of my greatest triumph. I began planning not just for legal victory, but for a demonstration that would show Kevin and anyone else who doubted me exactly how far I'd risen above their limitations. Captain Wright accelerated my training schedule to help me achieve my private pilot license before the divorce hearing. He understood the symbolic importance of that milestone and worked with me through intensive ground school sessions and frequent flight training to ensure I was prepared for the practical examination. His support went beyond professional instruction to become genuine mentorship, and he often reminded me that aviation attracted people who refused to accept other people's limitations. As the divorce proceedings intensified and my aviation skills advanced, I began experiencing a sense of power and self-determination that I'd never felt during my marriage. Every successful flight reinforced my ability to make critical decisions under pressure. Every photography assignment proved my professional competence, and every legal victory demonstrated that I could navigate complex challenges without Kevin's input or approval. The woman who'd been abandoned at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport was evolving into someone entirely different, a pilot, entrepreneur, and survivor who would soon have the resources and skills to literally soar above any situation that threatened her independence. Kevin had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible by forcing me to discover my own strength, and I intended to make sure he fully understood the magnitude of his mistake. The morning of my check ride dawned clear and calm, perfect flying weather that felt like the universe aligning to support my transformation. I arrived at Desert Wings Aviation before sunrise, methodically completing my pre-flight inspection of the Cessna 72 that had become as familiar to me as my own car. The Federal Aviation Examiner, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Rodriguez, watched my preparations with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen countless pilots earn their wings. Her presence was intimidating, but I'd learned to channel nervous energy into focused performance. The oral examination lasted 2 hours, covering everything from weather systems and airspace regulations to emergency procedures and aircraft systems. Linda's questions were thorough and challenging, but Captain Wright's training had prepared me well. When she asked about decision-making scenarios that might arise during cross-country flights, I drew on the real-world experience I'd gained managing my divorce proceedings and business development. The parallels between piloting aircraft and navigating life challenges had become increasingly clear during my training, The practical flight examination tested every skill I'd developed over the past 6 months. Linda evaluated my takeoffs and landings, navigation accuracy, radio communications, and emergency response procedures with methodical precision. During the simulated engine failure exercise, I executed the emergency checklist flawlessly and selected an appropriate landing site while maintaining my composure throughout the scenario. The confidence I'd built through months of challenging circumstances served me well under examination pressure. When Linda announced that I'd passed both portions of the check ride, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. She handed me my temporary pilot certificate with congratulations and a reminder that earning my license was just the beginning of a lifelong learning journey. Captain Wright's pride was evident as he shook my hand and officially welcomed me to the fraternity of licensed pilots. The small celebration at the hangar included several other pilots who'd supported my training, creating a sense of community that contrasted sharply with the isolation I'd experienced during my marriage. Marcus Thompson arrived during the celebration with exciting news about our developing partnership. Sarah Chen had reviewed my training progress and business portfolio, and she was ready to formalize our aircraft ownership arrangement. The plane she'd selected was a Beechcraft Bonanza, a high-performance single-engine aircraft that represented a significant step up from the training planes I'd been flying. The partnership would give me access to sophisticated equipment while providing Sarah with a qualified pilot for her business and personal travel needs. The Bonanza was everything I'd dreamed of during my early training flights: sleek, fast, and equipped with advanced avionics that would challenge my growing skills. Sarah had customized the interior with luxury appointments that reflected her successful real estate career, but she'd also prioritized safety equipment and navigation technology that would support serious cross-country flying. The aircraft was based at Scottsdale Airport, one of the busiest general aviation facilities in the Southwest, where I would complete my transition training and advanced certification. My divorce hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Patricia had orchestrated our strategy to maximum effect. Kevin's legal team had consistently underestimated my capabilities and resources, expecting the frightened woman who'd disappeared from the airport 6 months early. Instead, they would face a licensed pilot with a growing aviation business and documented financial independence that made their claims about my competency laughable. The financial discovery process had revealed the full extent of Kevin's deception and desperation. Beyond the gambling debts and hidden investments, David Kim had uncovered evidence that Kevin had been researching life insurance fraud cases and consulting with questionable financial advisors about maximizing payouts from spousal policy. His internet search history obtained through our joint computer accounts painted a disturbing picture of someone who'd been contemplating scenarios that were far from accidental. Patricia had worked with local law enforcement to document these findings, though she warned that criminal charges would be difficult to pursue without evidence of actual attempts to harm me. However, the investigation had been sufficient to freeze Kevin's access to our joint accounts and ensure that my safety concerns were taken seriously by the court. The judge had granted temporary restraining orders that prohibited Kevin from contacting me directly or interfering with my business activities. Kevin's behavior had become increasingly erratic as the legal pressure mounted. Nicole reported that he'd been calling family members with wild accusations about my mental state and demanding that they help him locate me for what he claimed were urgent financial discussions. His work performance had apparently declined significantly, resulting in probationary status and threats to his employment that only increased his desperation. The aviation community's support network had been invaluable during this stressful period. Captain Wright connected me with other women pilots who'd faced similar challenges, and their advice about safety precautions and legal strategies proved invaluable. Several had offered to provide character testimony if needed, describing my training progress and professional demeanor in ways that contradicted Kevin's narrative about my alleged instability. Marcus had also introduced me to his network of aviation professionals, many of whom became potential clients for my photography services. The specialized nature of aircraft photography commanded premium rates, and my growing reputation had resulted in assignments throughout the Southwest. The combination of technical expertise and artistic vision that aviation photography required played to my strengths while building the financial independence that was crucial to my divorce strategy. Sarah Chen's mentorship had extended beyond our aircraft partnership to include business development advice and networking opportunities. Her success in male-dominated industries, had taught her valuable lessons about projecting confidence and competence that applied directly to my situation. She'd observed that many successful women had overcome significant personal challenges by channeling their struggles into professional excellence, and she encouraged me to view my divorce as fuel for future achievement rather than just an obstacle to overcome. The week before my hearing, I completed my transition training in the Beechcraft Bonanza with an instructor who specialized in high-performance aircraft. The plane's capabilities far exceeded anything I'd flown during basic training, requiring precise engine management and sophisticated navigation skills that pushed my abilities to new levels. The learning curve was steep, but my recent experience handling complex challenges had prepared me for the intensive focus required. My first solo flight in the Bonanza was a revelation. The aircraft's performance capabilities made cross-country travel practical and enjoyable in ways that training planes couldn't match. During a practice flight from Scottsdale to Sedona, I covered the same route that had taken 2 hours by car in just 30 minutes of flying time. The efficiency and freedom of personal aviation reinforced my understanding of why successful people invested in aircraft ownership. Captain Wright had arranged for me to use Desert Wings Aviation's facilities to prepare for my instrument rating, the next certification level that would allow me to fly in challenging weather conditions. The additional training would enhance my qualifications for charter work while providing the skills needed to operate safely in the complex airspace around major metropolitan areas. The investment in advanced training was significant, but Sarah's partnership arrangement included funding for my continued education in exchange for my piloting service. The day before my divorce hearing, I received an unexpected call from Elena Vasquez, who'd been following my aviation progress through social media and professional network. She was preparing a photography exhibition featuring women who'd overcome adversity to pursue unconventional careers, and she wanted to include a series documenting my journey from abandoned wife to licensed pilot. The project would require several photo shoots at various aviation locations, creating additional exposure for my business while telling an inspiring story about personal transformation. Elena's exhibition concept resonated with themes I'd been exploring in my own work, and I eagerly agreed to participate. The project would document not just my aviation achievements, but the broader story of how crisis could catalyze growth when met with determination and strategic action. Her artistic vision would help communicate the emotional journey behind my professional accomplishments, showing how personal pain could be transformed into purpose. Patricia held a final strategy session the evening before our hearing, reviewing our evidence and preparing responses to likely arguments from Kevin's legal team. Our case was strength forward. I'd contributed significantly to our marital assets. Kevin had engaged in financial deception and fraud, and his attempts to control our narrative through claims about my mental state were contradicted by extensive evidence of my competence and success. The morning of the hearing, I arrived at the Maricopa County Family Court building wearing a professional pilot's uniform that Sarah had helped me select. The outfit projected competence and authority while serving as a visual reminder of my transformation. Patricia had arranged for several character witnesses to attend, including Captain Wright, Marcus Thompson, and Elena Vasquez, though she expected we wouldn't need their testimony given the strength of our documented evidence. Kevin arrived with his attorney looking haggard and desperate, clearly unprepared for the professional presence I now projected. His shock at seeing me in pilot's attire was visible, and I watched him struggle to reconcile this confident woman with the person he'd abandoned at the airport. His attorney's opening arguments relied heavily on outdated assumptions about my capabilities and financial knowledge that were easily contradicted by recent evidence. Patricia's presentation was methodical and devastating, systematically documenting Kevin's financial deception while highlighting my business development and professional achievement. The contrast between his gambling debts and hidden assets versus my transparent business partnerships and aviation certifications painted a clear picture of who could be trusted with financial responsibility. The judge's questions focused primarily on Kevin's concealment of marital assets, rather than any concerns about my competency. Kevin's attempt to testify about my alleged mental instability backfired spectacularly when Patricia cross-examined him about his own behavior. His explanations for the gambling debts, insurance policy changes, and internet research about spouse-related insurance claims were unconvincing and self-incriminating. When confronted with evidence of his deceptive practices, he became defensive and angry in ways that undermined his credibility with the court. The judge's ruling exceeded even Patricia's optimistic expectations. Kevin was ordered to pay substantial spousal support to compensate for his financial deception, and his access to our shared assets was permanently restricted, pending full accounting of his hidden investment. The court also noted that his behavior patterns suggested potential criminal activity that might warrant further investigation by appropriate authority. Outside the courthouse, Kevin made one final attempt to intimidate me, approaching despite the restraining order restrictions and demanding a private conversation about our future. His desperation was pathetic rather than threatening, and I simply informed him that all communication should go through our attorneys as the court had ordered. The transformation was complete. The woman who'd once feared his disapproval now felt nothing but pity for his self-destructive choices. Patricia drove me to Scottsdale Airport, where Marcus and Sarah were waiting with the Beechcraft Bonanza, ready for a celebratory flight to Sedona. The symbolism was perfect, taking off from the same metropolitan area where Kevin had abandoned me, now as the pilot in command of my own aircraft. As we climbed out of the busy Scottsdale airspace and turned north toward the Red Rocks, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The flight to Sedona was smooth and exhilarating, showcasing the Bonanza's performance capabilities, while providing stunning views of the Arizona landscape that had become my sanctuary. Sarah handled the radio communications from the right seat, allowing me to focus on the pure joy of flying my own aircraft to a destination that represented healing and growth. The 30-minute flight covered the same distance that had taken me 2 hours to drive during my original escape from Phoenix. Landing at Sedona Airport felt like completing a circle that had begun with my desperate flight from Kevin's abandoned. Captain Wright was waiting on the ramp with Carmen Delgado and several other friends who'd supported my transformation journey. The impromptu celebration in the hangar included champagne, congratulations, and stories about the remarkable changes they'd witnessed over the past month. Carmen observed that I looked completely different from the broken woman who'd arrived at her bed and breakfast 6 months earlier. The transformation went beyond external changes like my pilot's uniform and confident posture to include fundamental shifts in how I carried myself and interacted with the world. She'd watched me evolve from someone who sought permission for basic decisions to a leader who made complex choices with calm authority. Elena documented the celebration with photographs that would become part of her exhibition about women overcoming adversity. The images captured not just my aviation achievements, but the community of supporters who'd encouraged my growth and believed in my potential when I'd stopped believing in myself. The contrast with my isolated existence during marriage to Kevin was stark and meaningful. As the sun set over the Red Rocks, I stood beside my aircraft, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunity. The divorce was finalized, my pilot's license was earned, and my aviation business was thriving. But more importantly, I'd discovered reserves of strength and determination that would serve me throughout my life. Kevin's abandonment at the airport had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the chance to discover who I really was when freed from his limiting expectations. The final moment of vindication came the next morning when I flew back to Phoenix for a business meeting with a potential charter client. As I taxied the Bonanza to the General Aviation Terminal at Phoenix Sky Harbor, I passed the main terminal where Kevin had left me stranded just 7 months earlier. The symmetry was perfect, returning to the scene of my abandonment as the pilot in command of my own aircraft, completely independent and successful beyond anything he could have imagined. Kevin would eventually learn about my aviation career through mutual acquaintances, and I hoped the knowledge would force him to confront the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd dismissed me as weak and dependent, incapable of surviving without his support and guidance. Instead, his abandonment had catalyzed a transformation that elevated me far beyond the limited life he'd envisioned for us together. The woman he'd left behind no longer existed, replaced by someone who soared above any constraints others might try to impose. 18 months after my divorce was finalized, I stood on the tarmac at Phoenix Sky Harbor's General Aviation Terminal, conducting a pre-flight inspection of my newest acquisition, a twin-engine Beechcraft Baron that represented the culmination of everything I'd built from the ashes of my abandoned marriage. The sleek aircraft bore the distinctive livery of Morgan Aviation Services, the charter company I'd established with Sarah Chen as my business partner and mentor. What had begun as a desperate escape from Kevin's cruelty had evolved into a thriving enterprise that employed 4 pilots and served clients throughout the American Southwest. The early morning air was crisp with the promise of another busy day ahead. My schedule included a charter flight to Las Vegas for a group of executives attending a conference, followed by a positioning flight to Tucson to pick up a client returning from a medical appointment. The variety and challenge of charter operations kept me engaged while providing the financial independence I'd never imagined possible during my marriage. Each flight reinforced lessons I'd learned about self-reliance, strategic planning, and the importance of making decisions based on facts rather than emotions. Marcus Thompson had become more than a business partner. He was now my operations manager and closest confidant in the aviation world. His expertise in aircraft acquisition and maintenance had been invaluable as we expanded our fleet, and his network of industry contacts had provided the foundation for our client base. The working relationship we developed was built on mutual respect and shared goals, a stark contrast to the controlling dynamic I'd experienced with Kevin. Marcus encouraged my professional growth and celebrated my achievements without feeling threatened by my success. Our newest pilot, Jennifer Walsh, was a former military aviator who'd transitioned to civilian aviation after completing her service commitment. She reminded me of myself during those early days of flight training, hungry to prove herself capable of handling any challenge while building confidence through systematic skill development. Mentoring Jennifer had become one of my most rewarding responsibilities, allowing me to pay forward the support I'd received from Captain Wright and others during my own transformation. The charter business had exceeded our most optimistic projections, benefiting from the post-pandemic surge in private aviation demand. Wealthy individuals who'd previously relied on commercial airlines discovered the convenience and safety of private charter services, while businesses found that executive travel via charter aircraft often proved more cost-effective than the delays and complications of airline schedules. Our reputation for reliability and professionalism had generated substantial repeat business and referrals. Elena Vasquez's photography exhibition featuring my transformation story had opened 6 months earlier at a prestigious gallery in Scottsdale, attracting significant media attention and new business opportunities. The powerful images documenting my journey from abandoned airport wife to successful aviation entrepreneur had resonated with audiences far beyond the art world. Several corporations had hired me to speak at leadership conferences about overcoming adversity and pursuing unconventional career paths, adding another revenue stream to my diversified business portfolio. The speaking engagements had been unexpectedly fulfilling, allowing me to share lessons learned during my darkest moments with others facing similar challenges. My message focused on the importance of viewing crisis as opportunity, the value of building supportive networks, and the necessity of taking calculated risks to achieve meaningful change. Audiences were particularly interested in how aviation had provided both literal and metaphorical vehicles for escaping limiting circumstances. Carmen Delgado had become a lifelong friend whose wisdom continued guiding my personal and professional development. Her bed and breakfast in Sedona remained a sanctuary where I retreated whenever the pressures of business ownership became overwhelming. During quiet evenings on her patio, surrounded by the red rocks that had witnessed my initial healing, we would discuss philosophy, relationships, and the ongoing process of becoming who we were meant to be rather than who others expected us to become. My relationship with Tyler had deepened significantly since my divorce, as we'd discovered shared interests in adventure travel and outdoor activities that Kevin had discouraged during our marriage. Tyler's software engineering career had flourished during the same period, and he'd used his financial success to pursue mountain climbing expeditions that I now joined whenever my schedule permitted. Our shared adventures had created bonds that went far beyond sibling loyalty to include genuine friendship and mutual admiration. The legal aftermath of my divorce had continued for months beyond the initial hearing, as investigators pursued criminal charges related to Kevin's financial fraud and insurance manipulation scheme. Patricia Hernandez had coordinated with federal authorities to ensure that Kevin faced appropriate consequences for his deceptive practices, though I'd chosen not to participate actively in the prosecution. My focus remained on building my future rather than dwelling on his failures, though I was gratified to learn that justice was being served. Kevin's employment situation had deteriorated rapidly following our divorce, as his gambling debts and legal troubles made him unemployable in the medical device industry where reputation and trustworthiness were essential qualifications. Nicole reported that he'd moved back to their childhood home in Ohio, working various temporary jobs while awaiting trial on fraud charges. His fall from ambitious executive to desperate defendant had been swift and self-inflicted, serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing appearance over character. The contrast between Kevin's decline and my ascension was stark but not something I dwelled upon with satisfaction. His choices had been his own, just as mine had been mine. The difference was that I'd chosen growth, responsibility, and authentic relationships while he'd chosen deception, manipulation, and shortcuts that ultimately led to destruction. Our divergent paths illustrated fundamental differences in values and character that had probably existed throughout our marriage, but hadn't become apparent until crisis forced them into the light. Sarah Chen had become both mentor and friend, sharing insights about business development that extended far beyond aviation into broader principles of entrepreneurship and leadership. Her success in real estate had taught her valuable lessons about market analysis, client relations, and strategic planning that applied directly to our charter operation. She'd also introduced me to other successful women entrepreneurs who formed an informal network of mutual support and collaboration. The aviation community's embrace of my success had been overwhelming and deeply meaningful. Captain Wright had nominated me for the Arizona Aviation Association's Pilot of the Year award, citing not just my technical achievements, but my contributions to promoting aviation careers among women facing life transition. The recognition had led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting arrangements with flight schools, seeking to attract non-traditional students. My photography business had evolved alongside my aviation career, with increasing demand for specialized aircraft documentation and marketing material. The technical knowledge I'd gained through pilot training enhanced my ability to capture aircraft in ways that emphasized their performance capabilities and luxury appointment. Several aircraft manufacturers had hired me to create marketing campaigns for new models, combining my artistic vision with deep understanding of what attracted potential buyers. The financial independence I'd achieved exceeded anything I'd thought possible during my marriage, when my income had been treated as supplemental rather than substantial. Charter operations generated consistent revenue, while my photography work commanded premium rates due to its specialized nature. Speaking engagements and consulting arrangements provided additional income streams that weren't dependent on flight schedules or weather conditions, creating financial stability that supported my long-term goal. Personal relationships had evolved dramatically as I'd learned to prioritize authenticity over accommodation. The friends I'd maintained during marriage to Kevin had largely been his colleagues and their spouses, relationships built around professional networking rather than genuine connection. My new friendships were based on shared interests, mutual respect, and emotional support rather than social convenience or career advancement. Dating had been complicated by my newfound independence and success, as many men seemed intimidated by my aviation career and business ownership. However, I'd recently begun seeing David Martinez, a wilderness rescue pilot whose own adventures and achievements matched my energy and ambition. Our relationship was built on equality and mutual admiration rather than the hierarchical dynamic I'd experienced with Kevin. David encouraged my goals and celebrated my successes without feeling diminished by my accomplishments. The personal growth I'd experienced extended beyond professional achievements, to include emotional maturity and spiritual development that grounded my daily life. Regular meditation practice, outdoor adventures, and meaningful work had created a sense of purpose and fulfillment that didn't depend on external validation. The woman who'd once sought Kevin's approval for basic decisions now made complex business choices with confidence and clarity. My morning routine had become a cornerstone of mental and physical health that supported the demands of business ownership and charter operations. Early rising allowed time for exercise, reflection, and planning before the day's responsibilities began. The discipline I'd developed during flight training had extended to all areas of life, creating structure that enhanced rather than restricted my freedom. The anniversary of my airport abandonment had passed quietly, marked not with pain but with gratitude for the catalyst that had forced my transformation. What had seemed like the worst day of my life had actually been the beginning of the best chapter. Though I couldn't have recognized that truth at the time, the courage to leave a limiting situation had opened possibilities I'd never imagined, proving that sometimes the most devastating events create space for unprecedented growth. Elena's exhibition had toured several cities, sharing my story with audiences nationwide and inspiring other women to pursue aviation careers, despite unconventional entry paths. The response had been overwhelming, with many women contacting me to share their own stories of transformation and seek advice about overcoming similar challenges. These connections had reinforced my understanding that personal struggles often contain universal lessons that can benefit others facing comparable situations. The bed and breakfast where I'd found refuge during my lowest moments had become a pilgrimage destination for women seeking their own transformation. Carmen reported that guests frequently mentioned my story as inspiration for their own healing journeys, creating an informal network of mutual support among women rebuilding their lives. The ripple effects of sharing our stories authentically continued expanding in ways none of us had anticipated. My aircraft fleet had grown to include specialized equipment for different mission profiles, from the twin-engine Baron for executive charters to a rugged Cessna 8T configured for wilderness operation. Each aircraft served specific client needs while expanding my own capabilities as a pilot and business owner. The variety kept operations interesting while demonstrating the versatility that had made general aviation such a valuable tool for personal and professional growth. Charter clients often shared their own stories of overcoming adversity during flights, creating connections that went beyond simple transportation services. Many had faced challenges similar to mine: divorce, career transitions, health crises, or family difficulties that had forced them to rebuild their lives from scratch. These conversations reinforced my belief that resilience was a universal human capacity that could be developed through practice and proper support. The financial support I'd provided to other women pursuing aviation careers had become a formal scholarship program administered through the Arizona Aviation Association. Annual awards helped qualified candidates overcome the financial barriers that often prevented capable individuals from pursuing pilot training. The program had already graduated 3 women who were now working in various aviation careers, creating their own ripple effects of positive change. Speaking engagements continued expanding my influence beyond aviation into broader discussions about entrepreneurship, leadership, and personal transformation. Corporate audiences were particularly interested in how crisis management skills developed through flight training applied to business challenges, while women's organizations focused on strategies for building confidence and taking calculated risks in pursuit of meaningful goals. The luxury and convenience of private aviation had become routine aspects of my daily life, but I never lost appreciation for the freedom it represented. Every takeoff reminded me of the woman who'd been stranded at an airport gate, helpless and abandoned, compared to the pilot who now commanded sophisticated aircraft with confidence and authority. The transformation was visible not just in my professional achievements, but in my posture, my voice, and my willingness to take up space in the world. Today's charter flight to Las Vegas would take me over the same desert landscape where I'd driven during my desperate escape to Sedona 20 months earlier. The geography remained unchanged, but my perspective on it had been revolutionized by altitude and experience. Problems that had seemed insurmountable from ground level appeared manageable when viewed from several thousand feet above, a metaphor that had proven accurate in both aviation and life. The executives I was transporting to their conference had no idea that their pilot had once been abandoned at this same airport by a husband who'd viewed her as disposable. They saw only a professional aviator who arrived early, conducted thorough safety briefings, and operated their flight with calm competence. The invisibility of my personal history was liberating, allowing me to be judged solely on my current capabilities, rather than my past vulnerability. As I completed my pre-flight inspection and prepared for another day of charter operations, I reflected on the unexpected gift Kevin had given me through his abandonment. His cruelty had forced me to discover strength I'd never known I possessed, while his attempts to diminish me had instead catalyzed unprecedented growth. The woman he'd left behind no longer existed, replaced by someone who soared above any limitations others might try to impose. The morning sun illuminated the wings of my aircraft as passengers arrived for boarding, ready to trust their safety to my skill and judgment. Their confidence was well placed, built on thousands of hours of training and experience that had transformed me from victim to victim. As we taxied toward the runway where my new life truly began, I smiled at the perfect irony of how far I'd risen from the depths of that devastating day when everything I thought I knew about love and marriage had crumbled at an airport gate. Kevin had intended to break me, but instead he'd freed me to become who I was always meant to be. That realization filled me with gratitude rather than bitterness, as we lifted off into the brilliant Arizona sky, carrying passengers toward their destinations, while I continued flying toward mine. The most unexpected twist in my transformation came exactly 2 years after that devastating day at Phoenix Sky Harbor, when I received a call that would provide the ultimate vindication of my journey. Nicole Brooks, Kevin's sister who had become an unexpected ally during my divorce proceedings, contacted me with news that changed everything I thought I knew about my ex-husband's motivations for abandoning me at the airport. She had discovered documents in Kevin's abandoned apartment that revealed the true scope of his financial desperation at the time of our anniversary trip. Hidden beneath stacks of overdue bills and collection notices, she found detailed correspondence with loan sharks who had been threatening escalating violence if he didn't produce the money he owed within 48 hours. The timing meant that when Kevin had driven me to the airport that morning, he already knew he couldn't board the plane to Hawaii because dangerous men would be waiting for him when he returned. The revelation recontextualized everything about that horrible day. Kevin hadn't abandoned me because he was indifferent to our marriage or because he'd found something more important than our anniversary celebration. He had left me at that airport to protect me from the violent consequences of his gambling addiction, though he'd been too proud and ashamed to explain the real reason. The text message telling me to go without him or cancel the trip wasn't casual cruelty but desperate damage control from someone who knew his world was collapsing. Nicole also found evidence that Kevin had been planning to disappear entirely that weekend, using our Hawaii trip as cover to flee the country with whatever liquid assets he could gather. The offshore accounts I'd discovered during divorce proceedings weren't just hidden marital property but emergency escape funds he'd been accumulating for months. His plan had been to let me enjoy Hawaii alone while he vanished to avoid the physical retribution that his creditors had promised. The discovery explained so many puzzles from our final months together: his increasing anxiety, his reluctance to make long-term plans, his obsession with liquid assets and international investment options. What I'd interpreted as emotional withdrawal had actually been the behavior of someone preparing to run for his life. His criticism of my family relationships and career ambitions hadn't been about control but about protecting me from association with his impending downfall. Learning this information created complicated feelings that I hadn't expected. The anger I'd felt about his abandonment was tempered by understanding that he'd faced an impossible choice between honesty that would endanger me and deception that would hurt me. His solution had been characteristically selfish and cowardly, but it hadn't been motivated by the callous disregard I'd assumed. He had, in his own deeply flawed way, been trying to protect me from consequences I couldn't have imagined. The loan sharks had indeed come looking for Kevin the Monday after our missed Hawaii trip, breaking into our house and destroying furniture when they found it empty. If I had been there waiting for his return from our anniversary vacation, I could have been seriously injured or worse. His abandonment, however cruel and inexplicable it had seemed, had probably saved my life by ensuring I was safely away from Phoenix during the most dangerous period of his crisis. This knowledge forced me to reevaluate my entire narrative about our marriage's end and my subsequent transformation. I'd built my new identity partly on the foundation of righteous anger about Kevin's betrayal, using that fury as fuel for the dramatic changes I'd made. Learning that his actions had been motivated by fear and misguided protection rather than malice complicated my emotional relationship with my own success story. However, the revelation also reinforced the importance of the choices I'd made in response to his abandonment. Regardless of Kevin's motivations, he had left me stranded at an airport without explanation, forcing me to navigate a crisis entirely alone. His failure to trust me with the truth had demonstrated fundamental problems in our relationship that went beyond his gambling addiction. A true partnership would have involved honest communication about the dangers we faced together, not unilateral decisions about what I could handle. The growth I'd experienced during my time in Sedona, the confidence I'd built through flight training, and the success I'd achieved in aviation had been real regardless of Kevin's underlying reasons for his behavior. His protection, however well-intentioned, had been based on assumptions about my weakness and inability to handle difficult truths. The woman I'd become through adversity was far stronger than the person he'd thought he was protecting. David Martinez, my wilderness rescue pilot boyfriend, helped me process these revelations during a camping trip to the Grand Canyon, where we could discuss the situation away from daily distraction. His perspective as someone who regularly dealt with life and death decisions was invaluable in helping me understand the complexity of Kevin's choices. David pointed out that Kevin's failure hadn't been in facing impossible circumstances, but in not trusting me enough to face them together. We spent hours hiking along the canyon rim, discussing how crisis reveals character in ways that normal life never does. Kevin's response to extreme pressure had been to isolate, deceive, and flee, while mine had been to seek support, learn new skills, and build sustainable solutions. These fundamental differences in our approaches to adversity had probably always existed, but hadn't been visible until circumstances forced them into the open. Elena Vasquez incorporated this new information into her traveling exhibition about my transformation, adding complexity to the narrative about how people respond to unexpected crises. The story became less about a woman escaping a cruel husband and more about how individuals can emerge stronger from devastating circumstances, regardless of the intentions behind them. The updated exhibition resonated even more powerfully with audiences who recognized the messy complexity of real-life relationships. My speaking engagements evolved to include discussions about forgiveness, understanding, and the importance of making positive choices, even when others' motivations remain unclear. Audiences appreciated the nuanced message that personal growth could occur independently of other people's actions or intentions. The story became more about agency and resilience than about victims and villains, though the transformation journey remained equally inspiring. Carmen Delgado observed that learning Kevin's true motivations had been an important part of my healing process, even though it came years after I'd moved forward with my life. She suggested that understanding rarely arrives on our preferred timeline, but wisdom could be gained from revelations whenever they occurred. The new information hadn't diminished my achievements but had added depth to my understanding of human complexity and moral ambiguity. The aviation business continued thriving as I applied lessons learned from this emotional processing to my leadership style and client relationships. Understanding that people's actions often stemmed from invisible pressures and fears made me more compassionate in difficult situations, while maintaining clear boundaries about professional standards. The combination of empathy and accountability created a work environment that attracted both excellent employees and loyal customers. Marcus Thompson noted that my management approach had become more sophisticated as I'd learned to separate others' intentions from the impact of their actions. This skill proved invaluable in business negotiations and conflict resolution, allowing me to address problems directly while maintaining respect for everyone involved. The emotional intelligence I'd developed through processing my divorce had unexpected professional application. Jennifer Walsh, our newest pilot, benefited greatly from this evolved approach to mentorship. When she struggled with confidence issues related to her military to civilian transition, I was able to provide support that acknowledged her fears while maintaining high-performance standards. The balance between understanding and expectations created an environment where she could grow without making excuses for temporary setbacks. Sarah Chen appreciated how my leadership style had matured to include greater emotional sophistication without losing the decisiveness that made me effective in crisis situations. She often remarked that the best entrepreneurs were those who could maintain strategic focus while understanding the human elements that influenced business relationships. My personal experiences had taught me to navigate complexity in ways that enhanced rather than compromised my professional effectiveness. Tyler visited me more frequently after learning about Kevin's true circumstances, partly from relief that his sister had unknowingly avoided serious danger and partly from admiration for how I'd processed the new information. He observed that many people would have used Kevin's revealed motivations as an excuse to minimize their own growth or question their life changes. Instead, I had integrated the information into a more nuanced understanding of my journey, without undermining my confidence in the choices I'd made. The scholarship program I'd established for women entering aviation expanded to include funding for crisis counseling and life coaching, recognizing that many applicants were dealing with circumstances similar to my own original situation. The holistic approach to supporting career transitions proved more effective than financial assistance alone, helping women address underlying confidence and relationship issues that might otherwise sabotage their professional development. My relationship with David deepened as we navigated this revelation together, demonstrating the difference between a partnership based on mutual respect and one built on protective deception. David's willingness to discuss difficult topics openly, combined with his confidence in my ability to handle complex emotions, provided a stark contrast to Kevin's assumptions about my fragility. The relationship modeled the healthy communication patterns I'd never experienced during my marriage. 3 years after my initial airport abandonment, I stood once again in the chaplain's office at Phoenix Sky Harbor, this time not as a stranded passenger but as a volunteer counselor helping other travelers navigate unexpected crises. Father Santos had invited me to share my expertise with people facing similar emotional emergencies, and I found deep satisfaction in providing the same kind of supportive presence that had been so crucial during my own darkest moment. The circular nature of returning to help others in the same location where I'd received help felt powerfully symbolic. The chaplain's office remained unchanged, with the same comfortable chairs and inspirational quotes that had provided sanctuary during my breakdown. However, my presence there as a helper rather than someone needing help demonstrated how completely my circumstances had transformed. During one particularly meaningful session, I counseled a young woman whose fiancé had abandoned her at the airport just hours before their wedding destination flight. Her devastation mirrored my own experience, but I was able to offer hope based on lived experience rather than theoretical comfort. Sharing specific details about how crisis had catalyzed my transformation provided concrete evidence that devastating endings could become powerful beginnings. Father Santos remarked that my volunteer work had brought a unique perspective to the chaplain's office, combining spiritual comfort with practical testimony about resilience and renewal. Many travelers found my story particularly compelling because it had unfolded in the same location where they were currently struggling. The specificity of the setting made my transformation feel achievable rather than abstract. The media attention surrounding my volunteer work and updated exhibition led to an invitation to write a book about my experiences. The publisher was particularly interested in the complex narrative about discovering hidden motivations years after making life-changing decisions based on incomplete information. The story resonated with contemporary discussions about relationships, communication, and personal agency in an uncertain world. Writing the book forced me to examine my journey with even greater depth and honesty, exploring not just the external events but the internal processes that had enabled my transformation. The exercise reinforced my understanding that growth had resulted from my choices rather than my circumstances, though the circumstances had certainly provided powerful motivation for change. The book's success led to opportunities for documentary film projects and podcast interviews that expanded my platform for encouraging others facing similar challenges. The message remained consistent. Crisis could catalyze extraordinary growth when met with courage, supported by community and channeled toward meaningful goals. Kevin's true motivations had added complexity to the story but hadn't changed its fundamental truth about human resilience. As I completed my morning pre-flight inspection of the Baron for another charter flight, I reflected on how the revelation about Kevin's motivations had ultimately strengthened rather than undermined my transformation story. Understanding that his actions had been motivated by fear rather than cruelty had allowed me to release the last vestiges of anger while maintaining pride in my achievement. The woman I'd become was strong enough to hold compassion for his impossible situation while celebrating her own remarkable growth. The engine started smoothly as passengers boarded for their flight to Denver, trusting their safety to my skill and experience. None of them knew that their pilot had once been abandoned at this same airport by a husband too ashamed to explain his desperate circumstances. They saw only a professional aviator who had earned their confidence through demonstrated competence and reliability. As we taxied toward the runway where my new life had truly begun, I smiled at the perfect symmetry of my journey. Kevin's abandonment had forced me to discover strength I'd never known I possessed, while his revealed motivations had taught me that understanding and forgiveness could coexist with boundaries and self-respect. The transformation had been mine to create regardless of his intentions, and the life I'd built was mine to enjoy regardless of his fate. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the Arizona sky, carrying passengers toward their destinations while I continued flying toward mine. Far below, the desert landscape spread in all directions, vast and beautiful and full of possibilities I was still discovering. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the greatest gifts when we have the courage to transform our pain into purpose, our setbacks into strength, and our endings into extraordinary new beginnings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.